Hi everyone, and welcome to our special program, Embracing Modernization, China's Reforms and Innovation, where we explore China's third plenary session of the 20th CPC Central Committee. The high-level meetings have wrapped up with the government focusing on economic policy, deepening reforms, and promoting Chinese modernization. The communique released at the third plenum says the overall objectives of deepening reform are to continue improving and developing the socialist system with Chinese characteristics and to modernize China's system and capacity for governance. It went on to say a high-standard socialist market economy is a guarantee for Chinese modernization, and says the role of the market must be improved, a fairer and more dynamic market environment must be fostered, and resource allocation must be made as efficiently and productive as possible. It also says high-quality development is the top priority of comprehensively building a modern socialist country, urging deepening supply-side structural reform, improving incentive and constraint mechanisms for promoting high-quality development and creating new drivers and strengths for realizing that growth. Finally, the communique is urging sticking to the basic state policy of opening up and continuing to promote reform through that opening. It states that China should rely on its advantages as an ultra-large market and enhance its capacity for opening up through international cooperation and build a new open economy system at a higher level. For more on the significance of the plenum and how it will shape the country's future, we're joined by Yukon Huang, Senior Fellow in the Carnegie Asia program. Albert Keidel, he's an economist and adjunct professor at George Washington University. And Jeff Moon, he's president of China Moon Strategies and a former assistant U.S. trade representative to China. Yukon, if I can, let's pick up and talk about a plenary session. Why is this so important, and to what degree do you think the world is looking at what is going on in the world's second largest economy?
Well, the plenum is traditionally laying out the policy agenda, longer-term policy agenda, for a new team. There was a major one in 2013 when Xi Jinping became president. There was another revival 5 years ago. But the one in 2013 was a very broad reform agenda which everyone has been comparing the performance over the last decade against. And now they're looking for signals as to whether that agenda will continue, how it will be modified. And we have, of course, a number of major themes that have come out in recent years. Focus on innovation and technology, concerns about the property market, slower growth. There is discussions about land and hukou reform and fiscal reforms. Environment has become more of a consideration. So all these issues have been addressed and talked about over the last year, 2 years, 3 years in a serious way. It's going to all come together in a major policy statement that everyone's going to be looking at.
And Albert, pick up on that just a bit. We talked about China's economy, and President Xi made it clear during 2 sessions that he wants the country not just made in China, but manufactured, technology, high-end stuff. Don't have to depend on outside nations so much moving forward. How important do you think that is going to be in these discussions that are going on?
Well, it's clear that the emphasis in the plenum was on new productive forces, is what they're calling it. And that's linked to something economists talk about with total factor productivity, which is kind of a fuzzy, maybe incorrect term, which is so with over and above how much capital you add and how much labor you have, you're going to get even an extra boost of productivity from something. And the other way to think about that is it often comes out when demand is strong or weak. You get extra boost or not. There's an old theory from the 1930s called the accelerator principle, that demand will suck out productivity from workers, from new investment, and from machinery and equipment that you already have. So there's some idea of how to get that extra ounce of productivity. If you think that the boost you're getting from new capital and your labor force is maybe leveling off in terms of size with the number of people that can move in from the rural areas. So this new productive forces has become really a catchphrase, and it's always interesting to me that no official that I've heard talks about this total factor productivity, but you see a lot of commentators that do. And so it's a regular 5-year cycle, and it's really long term. They don't really put out fires, but they talk about new institutions, and it, you know, it can have 60, 70, 80 items in it. It's a complete laundry list. And the question is, which ones are really key? Which ones are changes? Like Yukon mentioned just now, the 2013 one, it called for allowing the market forces to have a greater strength and force. And everybody said, oh, great, so things are going to liberalize. At the same time, it said to strengthen the role of market and state enterprises. So everything is blended in together. And then a lot of people thought that they didn't deliver, that they really didn't open up financially, liberalizing, and that they didn't open up the capital account, when in fact, they actually tried it and it blew up in their face. So that.
And I think that the plenum is going to be talking about issues that fall into two categories. There are forward-looking growth issues, new productive forces, favored sectors, favored technologies, manufacturing and exporting. Those are the first category. The second category is legacy issues, property, the balance, the fiscal problems of the local governments, demographics and the aging population. So there are two different kinds of things. And one of the purposes here is to set forth the agenda for the next 10 years or so, as we've been talking about.
And we have to think that in these discussions that went on, the environment is just a huge factor. I've been going there regularly since 2012, and the difference in the air quality is just amazing. And to talk about the EVs, I mean, to ride in their EVs is unbelievable. I mean, they're light years beyond the United States. There's no other way to say it.
Like their high-speed rail.
Yeah. So, I mean, you look at these, and I try to, you know, I hadn't been there in 5 years since COVID. And when I went, I came back and told my friends, and, you know, and all this is going to figure into the way China moves forward. It has a huge leg up on the United States in terms of fighting pollution, in terms of EVs, in terms of solar panels. It's moving in the right direction, while arguably the U.S. has its head stuck in the sand saying, bring back coal.
Yeah. Well, the decision for China to ramp up the green technologies, the EVs, electric vehicles, the batteries, was made a decade ago. And they poured in effort into that enormously. This concern here is just, let's say in the US, something that people are debating now. So it's not like it suddenly happened in China that they had this. They basically decided that the world needed this, and they invested in this. And now we have a problem because the world suddenly realized that this capacity technology largely resides in China, and it's become a security concern rather than a climate change issue.
Yeah, it's being called a second China shock. And the idea, the first was when they joined the WTO. And the way I've written about this is we had a choice in the United States in the 2000s, right after China joined. We could upgrade our labor force with a kind of a GI Bill program to raise skills, income earning ability, or if we didn't do that, then we needed to protect ourselves from the shock. This disruption that Yukon's rightfully talking about is something that every entity has to take care of because they've got a labor force that's kind of rigid in its usability and its transferability without an upgrade in training and so forth. And so that disruption needs to be handled, but it needs to be as part of a transition, as Yukon was just saying, which is to a higher productivity level for the domestic labor force. And that seems not to have been forthcoming. And so then you have to react to the shock with protectionist methods.
And I think that that's one thing that international companies look at. China's made it clear it wants to see more international investment in China.
They're certainly doing a lot and recently to make it more accessible and with fewer resistances. For example, they're strengthening the free trade zones, like the Hainan Island is a whole free trade zone, and it's been changing itself to make itself more attractive. They've opened up these free trade zones. I think there are 21 or 22 of them now. And there it's not, there's sort of an agglomeration effect where certain sectors agglomerate to certain zones. And there you have a lot of freedom for financial transactions that you don't have nationally. So much more flexible international flows of portfolio finance to support your work there. But again, it's managed, so it doesn't get out of control. And I think the State Council just last month let out a bunch of ideas about how to continue to make it more attractive. They've introduced some laws with new courts for intellectual property rights and also financial struggles between firms, so that there are specialized courts for these. And so I would say that the FDI program, where companies come in with their technology and then produce goods with Chinese labor, and then the Chinese gradually backward load into the feeding industries that would be imported. That's just been a brilliant source of Chinese growth and technology adaptation while they maintain global standards of quality.
Jeff, before I get to you, I'd like to hear Yukon's take on that.
When you talk about foreign direct investment from a U.S. perspective, it's actually quite different from a European perspective. If you go back 10 or 15 years ago, foreign investment from Europe and U.S. was exactly the same amounts. Today, Europe is multiples higher than U.S. So what explains the difference? Because it's not politics and human rights, they both have the political systems. The fundamental issue is the U.S. economy's strength lies in services. And China is very restrictive in allowing what I call foreign investment participation in the service sector, education, legal, accounting, nursing, whatever, all these kinds of areas, internet, retail, all sorts of kinds of things. But it's very open to manufacturing, okay? And that's Germany's strength, France's strength. Germany exports a very large share of its exports indirectly through China. So German, European companies invest a lot in China. But American companies are not manufacturers. So they're hurt more by what I call the higher restrictions on the service sector. But then if you go back to a second level, is the need for foreign investment from China the same today as it was 10 or 15 years ago? Not really. 10 or 15 years ago—
You don't think so?
No. China needed the money a little bit. It needed managerial expertise in a certain form. It's now a pretty sophisticated economy. Its competitive capacity to manufacture other is probably better than anyone else's. So what it's looking for in foreign investment these days is additional technology and knowledge, and it's becoming a little bit more careful in what it wants. What's the point of having someone coming in if it just duplicates something I have? But if it has something that I don't have or it's better than I have, China wants to welcome it.
In terms of how attractive China wants to make itself, I think the first half of this year, we just got data yesterday for the first half of the year, there were 37,000 new firms, FDI firms started in China by foreign firms. So that there's some things working to bring in a lot of people, but the structure and what sectors to the degree that then become important for national security at both sides. I mean, look at the US and what we're doing with TikTok. I mean, so on both sides, the cyber threat and the cyber warfare dimension to foreign direct investment, that's part of the security intrusion into US-China commercial relations.
It gets a lot of attention, this issue of unfairness, whether China subsidizes, and therefore this is a problem for foreign companies. And I think it's a complicated kind of issue. And let me just go back to the green technologies, vehicles, batteries, solar. China subsidizes the production of these items directly. We don't do that in the US. We subsidize the consumption of these items. Why is that? Because we give households and consumers business tax write-offs. You install these things, you get a tax write-off. We don't subsidize the direct production to the banking sector. Now in China, you can't do that because their tax system is not sophisticated enough to get households and businesses the ability to depreciate and write off. So their subsidies occur through the banking system to producers. Actually, the subsidies on both sides are equal, but they're done in different kinds of ways. Now overall, actually, US subsidization of activity is the same as China, but they subsidize different things. We subsidize football franchises moving around. We subsidize Amazon coming here. China doesn't do that, okay? So the other point I would make is when you look at that CSIS study, which showed an enormous amount of subsidies, 70–80% of that subsidy was one item. It was bank commercial flows at below market interest rates. Now, this is to me kind of an interesting question. Those below market interest rates, which were flowing to SOEs and people who were producing, were still higher than interest rates in the US. But they were lower than the market rates in China at that time. Now today's are kind of different because US interest rates are so much higher. So the issue for me is a little bit tricky here. Is that a subsidy? And the answer they would say in China is, well, these SOEs got lower interest rates because they're more credit worthy. You know, they have a guarantee of the state.
Right.
So if you look at the US parallel, AAA companies have lower interest rates than other companies. Why? Because they're more credit worthy. So a Chinese argument would be saying, we don't actually subsidize. Those rates reflect lower rates because they have a state guarantee. It's like localities in China, states and provinces, states counties in the US can borrow at a lower interest rate because they're safer than commercial borrowing would be. Is that a concession or subsidy, or is it to reflect the fact that the markets have determined that they have less credit risk when they lend to these entities? So I find that kind of subsidy issue very complicated from an economic viewpoint as to whether this is really a subsidy. And then when you try to compare it across countries with different financial systems, in my view, it's very difficult to actually square them.
I think that I've also read to a degree that this is viewed as an extension of policy. It's kind of an investment in their future, the way China wants to move. And with that in mind, how important do you think that this plenum is going to be to China's role internationally on a global scale in terms of the global economic situation?
It goes back part to this question. They're pouring lots of money into new industries, green technology, security, military, high tech, AI, new materials. And there's a big question as to whether this is unfair or appropriate. Now, in some sense, when I look at green technologies, our economic textbooks say to us, actually, there are externalities involved. These are public goods. And the argument for subsidizing them is quite strong because the commercial cost implications of these understate the advantages to the state. So somebody should be subsidizing it. So the fact that China's subsidizing in a global sense, in my view, is not an issue because economic textbooks tell us those green technologies should be subsidized. We want to encourage people to produce it. So when the IMF did a study, it showed that the consequence of the tech war, the trade war, would probably be a 1% reduction in China's growth rate, more or less right now.
Right.
Okay? But it showed that a 1% reduction in America's growth rate in the medium term, because America's ability to invest in technology and R&D would be hampered. So one of the interesting issues about the conflict is China's cost of being born now, America's costs are going to be born in the longer term, but both sides suffer. And I think this is the problem of this trade war, tech war. No one actually benefits in the long run.
But your question is interesting. How is this plenum influencing the global economy long term? And I think one of the things that this plenum is doing for China is saying that their growth trajectory is going to continue at a fairly healthy level. The kinds of changes they're making, we haven't talked about it in the fiscal system. There's a lot being done to try to strengthen the ability to transfer funds that are collected centrally, but then distributed unevenly to the poorest regions first and very little to Shanghai and Beijing. And this process of improving the income distribution while you're also using the modern technology forces, I mean, China grew at 2.2% last year. And that was with real estate in a huge slump. And actually, if you look, there are different ways to do it. They actually grew at 6.4% by the expenditure method, and they published that. That came out in the communique in March. But nobody talks about it. Actually, they published the components of it. And so this economy grew 6.4% by the global standard method, the expenditure method, which is consumption, investment, and so forth. So the fact that China can keep going this far means that, yes, by the middle of this century, China will be probably double the size of the US.
To what degree is obviously the plenum, the discussions going on that have gone on, how is that going to further that?
I see all of this recent history as really much more incremental and much less revolutionary. None of the ideas that we've talked about today, or that, as far as I know, they're talking about at the plenum, are new. There's nothing that's shocking here. All of these proposals and the various other structural proposals that are out there have been out there for a long time, and they're still percolating. And the Chinese are iterating and introducing some of these things over time. And this is all part of the national rejuvenation, where China, the next stage is going to become a middle-income country by 2035 with average income to say $20,000, something like that. They're moving in that direction, and it's going slowly. I think some of the press hype goes a little bit too far in terms of how dramatic this is going to be. I mean, I think that it is very important, and I think the political pageantry of all of it is important as a political message. But economically, I think a lot of this is incremental.
And the national rejuvenation, it goes back centuries to when China kind of fell asleep, and the British and the Dutch began the Industrial Revolution, and that then turned into warfare capability. And so the rejuvenation is to take back a position in the world that they once had as a commercial and fabricator of hand goods and so forth. And how to do that means you've got to catch up. You need to converge, is what the IMF says, and then pass if you can. But China's not going to be, by any realistic, ahead of the United States on a per capita basis till the end of the century. So the rejuvenation is a long-term process, and so it's just a sort of a cheering statement to say we are going to rejuvenate. We are going to be part of the world that's at the top of the mountain, and not necessarily running the mountain, but be at the top with the other countries.
A big seat at the table.
Yeah.
Yukon, whether it's incremental or something greater than that, I think a lot of people realize or believe that China is at a crossroads right now. How do you think the plenum is going to gauge success? What will it take?
I think that Xi Jinping's objective is to be a major innovative economy by 2049, a prosperous, harmonious, unified. I don't think he actually is concerned about GDP growth per se or the income levels. So this definition of modernization is more of a quality term rather than a quantity.
Gentlemen, I can't let you go without talking about AI. I know it's not, a firefighter's role. We're not planning how the country's going to move in the next 2 to 3 weeks, but clearly this is going to have a huge effect not only on China but globally, and they're one of the world leaders in this. To what degree do you think AI is a focus of the plenary leaders?
I think it's in the back of everyone's minds. It's one of the top priorities for new productive forces or Made in China 2025 or any of the new initiatives, the state-led initiatives. There's an enormous amount of money that's going into this. But this gets us into some of the thorniest problems between the US and China because, yes, on the one hand, AI can be wonderful in terms of finding new drugs, for example, or diagnosing diseases. One small ray of hope that has come out recently was that China introduced a resolution at the UN to try to help developed countries get more use of AI, and the US supported it. It got almost uniform support. And so that gets us into the area of governance, which maybe AI governance is one place where we can actually start cooperating.
And China's also been very clear that believing it needs to move forward and with caution in terms of AI. How important do you believe AI is in this session?
I think they, as Jeff said, they ascribe a lot of importance to AI and they're pouring a lot of resources into it. There are aspects of AI where China is a global leader. There are aspects where China is not. In the US, for example, generative AI is much more advanced. There is a problem, of course, in terms of access to the advanced semiconductors needed to move into some of these areas, and that'll be a big issue. On the governance structure, the studies I've seen are quite impressive in the extent that there's consultation and learning in China between those who are developing and those who are consumers and the industries in terms of the risks, how do you regulate it, how do you promote it. And I think actually the US could actually take a look at some of these kinds of things going on in China to get a better sense, because it is a very complicated issue for every country to try to get their hands on.
But on the commercial side, logistics, what you can do to reduce cost in logistics with AI is really phenomenal. And of course, the Chinese are working on that very closely with both their industries and their government. So I think that what it can do for design, I think it's really important commercially and in a scary way for the security side. So nobody's going to resist, nobody's going to be able to criticize a big effort to develop AI.
I'm going to give you the final word. We talked earlier about the 1978 Plenum, 2013. A lot of people wondering, could this be a watershed moment? Jeff has his thoughts on it. Let's hear yours.
I mean, I think I'm more a believer that there's a lot of continuity in what, and a lot of people call it Xi Jinping is doing this, Xi Jinping doing that. He sits at the apex of a huge supply of very smart people, the Planning Commission, and also the party school that brings information from local is up. He is the spokesperson for what is quite a commendable and remarkable source of information, ideas, creativity, and he gets to announce a lot of it. And so the continuity going forward has to do with seizing new technologies, investing in them, raising the labor force. I remember in the 1980s, they were training middle school teachers just a huge explosion in the education world. And now they have programs which are just sort of a continuation of that mood. We now need to identify talent. So they're going out and looking for really smart kids, and then they are investing in them in STEM. And so that they're available for the investments in the technology that will turn out to be the heart of this new productive forces that they're talking about. This plenum means that they have come through that, they have a consensus on where they're going. And so in that sense, it's a crossroad. To the degree that they've been struggling with COVID and struggling with a lot of other things, wondering how do we proceed, they've come together at this plenum, and I think it means, yes, they're not at a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn, but they sort of lift it off a little bit more, and I think that's why it will be remembered.
That's our special program, Embracing Modernization, China's Reforms and Innovation. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm Sean Keidel.